Okay, good evening everybody and welcome. As the name of this series implies, love, fear and compassion, arousing emotion in our spiritual life, there are three main emotions. Kabbalistically and throughout Hasidic writings, we are told that there are three layers or three rows of emotion: love, fear and compassion. Love on the right column, fear on the left column, and compassion in the middle column. These columns are described at length in Kabbalistic writings and what they signify. And the right side, being the side of love, is the stronger hand. Left side, weaker, because fear should be balanced in a way that it is less dominant than love. Love always should precede. And then compassion is in between, in the middle, which means that compassion is a little bit less easy to, or harder to define than the love and the fear. Love and fear we've been speaking about at length and what they mean and what they are. What compassion means and its use in the service of God, that we're going to discuss in this chapter 45 of Tanya. And in this we will see that the power of compassion is a power that is utilized in our service of God, which can be in some ways easier to access, even easier than love and fear. How so? We will have to examine as we go. Here we go. So we're going to discuss tonight compassion for a homeless soul, an easy path to love through the pathway of compassion. This is the theme of chapter 45. Says Rabbi Zalman, there is yet another direct road open to us all to serve God sincerely, and that is through the attribute of our patriarch Jacob, the attribute of compassion. So we're introducing now another path, a new path to serve God sincerely. Right? Remember, this part of Tanya is different to the earlier parts of Tanya. In early parts of Tanya, we spoke about serving God even when we don't feel anything, when we're not inspired, when our heart is not in it. In this section of Tanya, we're talking about how to bring your heart, your passion, your feelings into the service of God. Tanya is structured as an unraveling of various levels of service of God. The early chapters are the early introductory levels, and as you get further into the book, it is going deeper into higher levels of serving God. On a basic level, we have to do the right thing even when we're not in the mood. We have to act morally even when we're not inspired to. Whether you feel it or not, whether you're up to it or not, whether you're enthusiastic or not, is secondary to what you need to do. You've got to do the right thing. That's the early parts of Tanya. But now we're saying, however, we shouldn't settle with that. We shouldn't just be satisfied with doing the right thing without any feeling, but we should graduate to do it with passion, do it sincerely. As you'll recall, if you're insincere about the good that you do, it's still good. But it's better if you do it with true sincerity. And so now Rabbi Zalman in chapter 45 is introducing another path to inspire sincere service of God, to live morally with enthusiasm and with feeling, with passion. And this time, it's through the attribute of compassion, which he says is a direct road and open to us all. Because Tanya is not about introducing ways of serving God that are set aside for special people. It's only for the very high and holy souls. This is about all of us. Any of us can do this. It's open to us all. It's a direct road. Meaning, you don't have to go on a roundabout route. This is a very direct route to serve God through the attribute of our patriarch Jacob, referring to the third patriarch of the Jewish people, Abraham being the first, then his son Isaac, and then Jacob the third. And his attribute is the attribute of compassion. What does he mean here, and why is he bringing in the patriarch Jacob? There's an understanding that's found throughout Kabbalistic writings, particularly the Zohar, and also the Hasidic commentaries on the Torah, that the stories of the beginnings of the Jewish people, the patriarchs and matriarchs of the Jewish people, are not stories of just once upon a time, but the lives that they lived embodied features, attributes that apply for the future generations. The reason why the patriarchs are called patriarchs is because they bequeathed to their children for all generations certain attributes. They lived a life that was for the future, not just for themselves. And so Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were called the patriarchs. Now, of course, their children and the many generations since then, all the way down to us, are all our ancestors. But patriarchs, only three: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that is because these three, each of them embodied in their life a certain attribute that we have inherited as their children. Those attributes are: Abraham represents the power of chesed, which is loosely translated as love. Isaac, the power of gevura, which is the emotion of fear. And Jacob, tiferet, which is translated as compassion. What are these things and how are they found in the lives of these three great leaders? Abraham was a man of chesed, a man of love. He was known to be extremely hospitable, inviting anybody into his home as a guest. He was kind, generous, loving, lenient, easygoing, accepting to anyone that came his way. These are all attributes of chesed. Because chesed, as we've seen previously, means expansiveness, openness, outwardness. And so Abraham was a chesed character to the extreme. This was the opposite of his son. His son Isaac was a gevura person, which means a person of discipline, of strictness, of exactness, inwardness, and therefore fear. In reading the stories about Abraham and Isaac, we find a lot that we hear about Abraham, his travels, his interactions with people, his job as a parent, in interacting with his children. We hear about Abraham's personality quite a bit. There are several stories about him. When it comes to Isaac, we don't hear all that much at all. There's not much told about him. In fact, in almost all the stories that he appears, he is a passive player rather than an active player. We hear about him being brought almost as a sacrifice by his father Abraham, but this was Abraham's story, as if Isaac was just a prop in the story. We hear about his children, Jacob and Esau, and their struggles, and Jacob tricking his father by dressing up as Esau to receive his blessing. Again, Isaac being passive, his children being the active ones. There is not much we hear about Isaac himself, about who he was, what he did, what type of person he was. In fact, the only real story where Isaac is the main player is a story about digging wells, where the Torah tells us that he dug wells and the Philistines filled up the wells and he fought over them and he redug the wells that his father had dug. He was into digging wells. And that's it, which seems like quite an anticlimactic story about a forefather of the Jewish people, that he dug wells, that's it. What is Isaac about? What is his attribute? Who is he? What is there to go on? The answer is, the reason why there's so little to go on is because he is the power of inwardness, of gevura. Unlike Abraham, who is outwardness and chesed, kindness and love, Isaac is inwardness, strictness, harshness and fear. And therefore, there is going to be less to talk about because there's less on the surface. It's an inward motion. The difference between love and fear is that love is where the heart expands and opens and spreads. Fear is where the heart holds itself back, contracts within itself, shrivels up. That's the movement of the emotion. And that is the power of gevura, to hold back and to hold in. And therefore, gevura, there's going to be much less stories about Isaac, the father of gevura, than there is of Abraham, who is the man of kindness, of outwardness. This we can see in our own personalities. We each have these various features. We have kindness, love, chesed and outwardness. We also have gevura, strictness, harshness, fear, inwardness. Each one has it, but each person tends perhaps one way or the other. If we would look at extreme examples, it would illustrate the point better, that you can have a person who's an extreme chesed type. An extreme chesed type is a person who is very generous, very welcoming, very friendly and outgoing, very giving, but not all that well organized. That they, generally speaking, will not be very reliable if you need to, let's say, meet them at a certain time. When you make an appointment with a chesed person, expect that they will be at least 45 minutes late. At the best, that's if they're having a good day. This is not because they're not concerned about you. It's not because they don't mean well or that they're inconsiderate. On the contrary, they're so loving, they're so outward that it's hard for them to say no to anything, to hold back from anything, to stop themselves from doing something. So they're on the way to you, and then somebody needs help. Somebody calls them, somebody grabs their attention, and they can't turn away from it because a chesed person is outward, is giving, and therefore they're giving all over the place. So they can't divert and focus all that well. They're not going to be a very, very disciplined type. Discipline is gvura, is the other side. Chesed is undisciplined giving. And therefore, they will not be very organized in their life, an extreme chesed person. They're not very scheduled, because how can you schedule things when there's so much to do, and how can you say no? A gevura person, to the extreme, will be the exact opposite. A gevura person will be extremely organized, very regimented, very reliable and on time, to the point where they will not compromise their schedule for anything. That it doesn't matter what's going on. If they've got to be somewhere, they will be somewhere, and they will drop what they're doing in order to keep their schedule. And so if you really need them, say, sorry, I haven't got time right now. Because a gevura person is strict with themselves and also strict with others. Very much down the line, scheduled, programmed, and disciplined. What's better? What's a better personality? Well, both extremes probably are not great. And the ideal would be to have some type of balance between the two. But most of us will tend one way or the other. You see this also in parenting. There's chesed type of parenting and gvura type of parenting. A chesed parent is somebody who's lenient, loving, generous, gives a lot of space to their children, but also therefore doesn't give the boundaries, doesn't set down the rules all that well. A chesed parent will be spoiling their children more likely than putting them in line and showing them their guidelines. A gvura parent, on the other hand, will be extreme in the rules, in the laws. Bedtime is bedtime, there's no excuses. And you can't speak like that, and there are consequences. There's going to be consistent rules with a gvura parent. In the extreme, either of those will actually be horrible parents, because the extreme chesed parent doesn't give direction to their children. It's called spoiling for a reason. Spoiling means giving so much to the point where they're spoiled, they don't know what's right and wrong. A child from an extreme chesed parent will be very self-centered because they get whatever they want, and they will not have boundaries. They'll not know limits. They'll not know where to stop. Children thrive when they're given boundaries, when they know where they're supposed to be. As much as children rebel against rules, they want them, they need them. An extreme gvura parent, on the other hand, will have those rules very clear, but will be so stifling, so harsh, not letting a little bit of freedom, a bit of leeway, a little expression of the child. It'll just be like running the house like an army. And that also will be negative on the child. Of course, the balance always is the ideal, to have gvura and to have chesed. In the beginnings of our nation, these attributes were brought to us by our forefathers. Abraham was the extreme of chesed, and Isaac was the extreme of gvura. This did mean that in their own families, things didn't work out ideally in some ways. If we look at the children of Abraham, so he had a son called Ishmael, who didn't know the boundaries, who was a wild person. And Abraham's reaction to that was, Ishmael's great, he loved him. He accepted him as he was, which was beautiful. But it wasn't necessarily great news for Ishmael. Ishmael, Abraham's son, went off the path, partly due to Abraham's great exuberance, kindness, and lenience. So it didn't turn out so good. On the other hand, Isaac also had two sons, and one of them was Esau, who also did not go on a great path. And this was partly due to Isaac's great strictness and inwardness, that he didn't share what he needed to share with that son as well. Neither of those families turned out ideal. But that's the way it had to be. Because for the attribute of chesed to be fully expressed, it had to be in its extreme. For gvura to be expressed, it had to be in its extreme. But the ideal was to come to the next generation, Jacob. Because Jacob is compassion. Abraham had to be his extreme and Isaac his extreme. But there had to be a third patriarch, the patriarch Jacob, who brought somewhat of a harmony between chesed and gvura, between extreme kindness and extreme strictness and fear. This is Jacob's attribute, which is called Tiferet. Tiferet in Hebrew means beauty or harmony, a harmonizing of various energies. And this is translated in the world of emotions as compassion. There's the emotion of love, the emotion of fear, and then compassion is an emotion as well. It's an emotional state, it's an interaction. And compassion is seen as the balance between chesed and gvura, between absolute kindness and harsh strictness. How so? What would it mean to be compassionate and therefore balancing between love and fear? If I would ask you these three words, love, fear, and compassion, which one is compassion more similar to, love or fear?
Love.
Love. More similar to? Is it a bit similar to fear as well? Anything in common with fear? At first glance, not really. Love and compassion would go in one basket. Fear seemingly would go into a different basket. Or any translation that we've used so far, that if chesed is love, is outwardness, giving, generosity, kindness, lenience, tolerance, openness, all these things is chesed, and gevura is fear, strictness, discipline, harshness, being controlled and disciplined and regimented. All of those translations, it seems that compassion would not really have all that much in common with the gevura side, and would be much closer to the chesed side. So in what way is compassion a balance or a harmony of chesed and gevura?
With all the translations for gevura, all of them, I don't know about everybody else, but I'm hearing them in like with a negative connotation, or like a negative connotation, and the opposite with the chesed. But they don't all have to be negative. Like inwardness or strictness or regimented doesn't have to be negative. And if they were looked at from a positive way, they may be closer to compassion. I think that compassion is just closer to chesed at the moment because the words we're using to describe it are more positive. It could
be, but it could also be, depending on what type you are or where you tend towards, you'll identify one as positive, one as negative. If you ask a chesed extreme person, so what do you think about someone who's regimented, strict, and disciplined? They'll see that as all negative. Like that's cramping.
Or admirable.
If they wish that they weren't so chesed, then they're not extreme chesed.
Right.
An extreme chesed just is stuck in chesed and doesn't see it any other way. They can't understand how anyone can operate any other way. An extreme gevura person, when you say that this person is loving, outward, generous, and loose, and therefore unreliable, like they'll also hear the negativity of that. I said all very nice, but like, who does it help? But you're right. None of these attributes have to be positive or negative. They can be either. That each one of them can have positive or negative results.
Also, say you've got let's say a basin of hot water, and then you add cold water, so you're making the hot water turn warm,
Mm-hmm.
isn't it? And they're opposites.
Yep.
So isn't it the same there? The love and the fear, they're opposites, but you add the one to the other, you're diluting the one with the other to get compassion.
Okay, so if compassion is the mixture of love and fear, or chesed and gvura, so then it's like hot and cold that you get warm. So to understand how that would work, we need to understand what is the difference between a loving person and a compassionate person. If love is one side, which is the opposite of fear, and compassion is somehow the combination of the two, so that means compassion is something new, different, it's got its own identity, different to love. What's the difference between a loving person and a compassionate person?
Well, a compassionate person will recognize another person's hardships or fears or insecurities, vulnerabilities. So even if they're going to expect or to try and instill fear in that person, they're going to do it with chesed.
And a loving person?
In a loving way, they're going to give them those boundaries.
Okay. Whereas a loving person?
A loving person just doesn't give the boundaries, just showers them with everything that they think they want.
So, okay, so let's analyze this. A compassionate person will give what their recipient needs. Sometimes that's love, sometimes that's strictness. A loving person will only give love, not ever strictness. So that's an interesting distinction. That while the two sound very similar, to be loving and to be compassionate, and we use them sometimes almost interchangeably to show love and compassion, but they're actually quite different. A loving person, what the determining factor is them, is their own personality. I'm a loving person, therefore what I give is love. So too, a gvura person, what they give is that what they exude, what they connect through is fear, discipline, and strictness. That's just the way they are. They're defined by that, and therefore their interactions are defined that way. A person with true compassion means somebody who is able to sense the other and their needs. Not be stuck in their own paradigm, but to be in tune with the needs of the recipient and therefore act accordingly. To give what is needed at the time that it is needed. And so therefore that attribute, the attribute of compassion, is the ability to transcend self and to really connect with the other. To not be defined by who I am, but I can shape myself to be who you need me to be. And that is a completely different skill and a totally different persona than the chesed, the loving person.
So is it more altruistic?
Is it more altruistic? In a way, because it's less about me. It's more about the recipient. So that's much more altruistic. The chesed person may be sincere in their kindness, but they're not necessarily connecting to what the receiver needs. So if we think of a few examples, we can sometimes identify, either in ourselves or the people around us, extreme chesed types and the way they operate. They're the type that they will help you whether you like it or not. They will be there for you whether you need it or not. It's not really about your needs and your circumstance, it's about their kindness. Not saying that they're selfish, they're giving, they're generous, but their generosity is not necessarily aimed correctly.
It's not skillful.
Sorry?
Not skillful.
Not skillful. Yeah. They will lack tact. They'll lack timing. They'll lack sensitivity. And so they'll be very helpful, but I don't know if I needed that help. So I remember once having a relative, a distant relative, who was looking after my kids while my wife and I were out once, and they wanted to help to look after the kids, which was wonderful. When we came home, not only did they look after the kids, but they rearranged the pantry as well. Because, like, to help, like I'm seeing the kids are all asleep, so to help out. So we've rearranged your pantry and moved things around in the kitchen and cleaned things up for you. That is an act of chesed, that's kindness. They weren't doing it for themselves, they're doing it for us. But, like, it's not exactly what we asked for. And so we couldn't find anything for weeks, but it was very organized. It's just not what we asked. And so sometimes someone will offer help or just take the initiative and give help. They're helping and it's beautiful, it's wonderful, it's kindness. But like, I didn't ask for that, I don't need that. And actually, I didn't want it. A chesed person won't realize that their kindness is indiscriminate. A compassionate person means somebody who senses what you need, who is attentive to what you're asking for what you need, and that's what they give. Not necessarily what you want also, but it's what you actually really need. But they're sensitive to it from you, not from them. It's not that I decide it, it's that I can see where I'm needed and I know where I'm not needed. I can see where I can help and I also sense where I'm not wanted or I don't need to be there. And so they will only do what's helpful, and they will not push themselves in, because it's not about me helping, it's about you being helped. It's a totally different thing. And this is where people can be very misunderstood. It's quite hurtful for a chesed person who has, I just out of the goodness of my heart, helped you out, and you're not very appreciative of that. Like, here I went out of my way for you, and not only you're not thankful, you're upset at me for what I did, but I did it for you. But they're not realizing you did it for me, but I didn't want that. I didn't ask that. I didn't need it. It's actually not helping me. But the chesed person doesn't get that. A compassionate person, a tiferet person, is a person who has the sensitivity to know it's not about me helping you. It's not about what I'm doing. It's about what is appropriate for you. Sometimes the greatest help will be to get out of there, to be out of the way, to just not be present at all. Sometimes the greatest thing you can do is to keep your mouth shut, is to say nothing, to do nothing, to stand back. And that is the greatest help. And a tiferet person will have the tact, the sensitivity to know that.
You talked about extreme chesed and extreme gvura. Is there extreme tiferet?
That's a good question. Is there extreme tiferet? If chesed and gvura can both be positive or negative, they can be corrupted or they can go too far. Can tiferet go too far? Can you be too compassionate? I would say yes. I would say that you could be. When a person is so tactful that they never assert themselves at all. When a person is so sensitive to their surroundings that there's no me, there's only what you want to hear from me. That, I think, would be a corruption of tiferet. You can have a person who is so in tune with what you want to hear that they only ever tell you what you want to hear.
What do you mean to hear?
Well, in the corrupt form, it's also just what you want to hear. I know what will make you happy. So I'm sensitive to that through my tiferet. So therefore, I'm only going to be that way.
Isn't that chesed?
No. Chesed is that it's regardless of what you need or want, I'm being kind. Tiferet is that I'm in tune with what you need and I'll act accordingly. But that can also, it can be used to just make you happy. That would be, I think, a corruption of tiferet. I'm acting in the way like a person who, in each crowd they're in, they're a totally different person, and they'll contradict themselves just to fit into this crowd or fit into that crowd. That is tiferet. It's sensitivity, but it's not using it in the right way. A good con artist would have a lot of good tiferet, where they know exactly what your weak point is, they know what you need to hear, and that's what they're going to say. That's the corruption of tiferet. So, how is tiferet therefore the mixture of chesed and gvura? How is it bringing the two together to create something new? Because sometimes it will be the giving of chesed, sometimes it will be the holding back of gvura, sometimes it will be the leniency of chesed, sometimes it will be the strictness of gvura, depending on the circumstance. It's giving, but discriminate giving. The discriminate part of it is the gvura part of compassion, of tiferet. The ability to discriminate, that's a gvura movement. And so while chesed is indiscriminate giving, and gvura is indiscriminate holding back, no matter what, I'm holding back, tiferet will be balancing the two to say, I can give in a measured way, in a way that's appropriate. I can time things right. I can measure things right. Going back to the parenting example, a parent who's parenting with tiferet means I may be very chesed or maybe gvura. My nature might be to be very strict or to be very lenient. That might be my nature. But as a parent, I can't just act according to my nature. I have to be sensitive to the needs of my children. And so sometimes my child might do something really cute and very naughty. And so my chesed nature is to enjoy that and to laugh at it or to just accept it. But they're doing something that's wrong that they need to be told. So I have to go beyond my chesed nature and be strict there and say, no, that's wrong, you can't do that. It's not about how my nature is, it's about what they need. So too, I might be very gvura in my nature, very strict and harsh, but if my child needs warmth, needs compassion and openness, so then I need to go out of my nature and be that way. It's what the child needs, what's appropriate for the time, not what I am. In that way, it is giving that's measured, chesed with gvura together, and that is tiferet, that is compassion. It's the ability to really sense the other. So, in this chapter, Rabbi Shneur Zalman is telling us that after we've discussed in previous chapters serving God with chesed, with love, serving God with fear, with awe, with gvura, there is another way, another path, and that is utilizing compassion in our service of God, which this needs to be explored. We understand readily what it means to love God, as we spoke about in the previous chapters, that when you think about your life and that your life is coming from God, you love life, so you love God. You love the goodness that He bestows upon you. To be in awe, also we understand, when you think about the idea that God is watching over you and expecting you to live a certain way, and He is experiencing your life through you, so you're in awe of Him, of His closeness, of His watchful eye. What does it mean to have compassion in our service of God, in our relationship with God? To have compassion for God? How does that fit in? Loving, okay. Being in awe, fine. But having compassion, what does that mean? So he explains. That is, says Rabbi Shneur Zalman, to arouse compassion for the divine spark which animates your soul, that has descended from its source, the life of life, who pervades all worlds and transcends all worlds, and in comparison with whom everything is accounted as nothing. Yet this spark has been clothed in a serpent's skin, which is far removed from the light of the King's countenance, at the greatest possible distance, since this world is the lowest point of spiritual concealment. Meaning, to arouse compassion for God, you can love God, you can be in awe of God, you can also have compassion for Him. Compassion for Him here means feeling what He is feeling, not what I'm feeling, but what He is feeling. It's not about my love or my awe, it's about what is God going through. Compassion for God here means that when you feel the concept that the divine spark which animates your soul, there's a godly spark which we've discussed at length that is your soul. Your soul is a piece of God. So He has invested a part of Himself in you. That's the driving force beneath your soul is godliness, is God, a part of Him. That spark has descended from its source, the life of life, the source of everything. It's gone down from God Himself. And God, who pervades all worlds, He fills all worlds, He transcends all worlds. In comparison to Him, there's nothing else. He's the ultimate. A piece of His ultimate essence, His self, He's invested in me. That's my soul, a piece of God. And where has that soul ended up? Where has that godliness ended up? It's been clothed in the serpent's skin. The serpent's skin is a Kabbalistic phrase that is referring to the body, the physical body. compared to the serpent skin, like the original serpent, the snake in the Garden of Eden, the embodiment of evil. Our body, our physical body, is the lowliness that our soul has been placed into. The serpent's skin. Our body with all its lowly cravings and lowly desires. That's where the soul is placed. Far removed from the light of the King's countenance. Far removed from its origin, its pure and pristine origins. At the greatest possible distance, it's so far away in this physical world, which is the ultimate of concealment of God. That's where the soul has descended. When you think about this, that should arouse in you a compassion for your soul and therefore by extension for God. This is a contemplation that Rabbi Shneur Zalman is suggesting, that when we think about where our soul comes from and where it has descended to, so then we have to feel bad for it. What is your soul? Your soul is this piece of purity, of holiness, of innocence. And it's plunged into this very ugly, lowly, base world, in a body with all its cravings. And everything that we have been involved in, and that we are involved in this physical world, and we're schlepping that soul, that piece of purity, along with us. When we contemplate that, so then that should arouse a sense of compassion, like, how can I do this to my soul, which is godly? Remember, a lot of Tanya is about splitting our personality and viewing it from one side to the other. That we are a body and a soul. We're an animal soul and a divine soul. We have a side that is totally pure and a side that is quite ugly and selfish. And by separating the two and viewing one from the view of the other, we start to get a greater perspective. Our soul is pure, is holy, but our body is not. Our body is selfish and base. And the two have been put together. A pure soul plunged into a physical body in the physical world. That is such a great descent that we can't help but feel a bit sorry for this piece of purity that has fallen so low. And this is Rabbi Shneur Zalman. This, by contemplating on this, when this idea becomes real, becomes vivid, that you have a soul that is pure, that is godly, and that it is stuck in this ugly world, then that will arouse compassion. You'll feel not your feelings, but you'll feel the divine feeling of descent, and that will arouse a love for God, as he'll explain further. To appreciate this, let's analyze how compassion works in our human world. When we see somebody like this, a homeless person lying on the street, so this should arouse some compassion. As we just walk by and we see somebody who's in a sorry state, we feel somewhat of a compassion. Just our humanity connects with his humanity, and we feel bad. We all have to manage these compassions. We can't be overwhelmed by them, and so most of us don't spend our entire day seeking out people to help on the street and trying to help them out. But when we do see it, we do feel bad. And of course, we think, well, but how did that person get there? And what are they doing here? And what will they do with their day? And how do they spend their time? And what opportunities have they been given that they haven't taken? And what help has been offered to them that they don't allow themselves to be helped? And there's all types of justifications in our mind to not be compassionate. But at the same time, we do feel a sense of, we feel something towards such a person. But what limits our compassion is that we don't know the story. Because we don't know the story, we don't know why that person is there. So therefore, there's always the possibility that somehow they've brought it upon themselves, that it's their choice, or that they're there because of their own doing. They have every opportunity to come out of it and they're choosing not to. Or whatever it is in our minds, we can always justify that maybe it's their fault. And that will somehow allay our compassion. We won't feel so bad walking past such a person, because who knows what they've done, who knows what brought them to that circumstance. But if we would know the story, if we would give the benefit of the doubt and say, well, it may be no fault of their own, as often is the case, so then our compassion would be aroused much more. And So if we would analyze the story, let's see if our compassion rises as we know the facts. In this particular case, this is the story of this man. His name is Moses. Let's look at his story. Moses is 53, a proud father and grandfather. But his life took a bad turn 2 years ago when his partner was admitted to hospital. She had suffered ill health for a long time and been on dialysis for 5 years and was now severely ill. Moses was away from home for 3 days, staying with her in hospital. So his story starts a sad but a normal story. A 53-year-old father and grandfather whose partner is not well. And so he's gone to spend time in hospital with her. He was away for 3 days with her in hospital. When he returned home, he found that friends who knew he wouldn't be home had broken in and were using his home as a place to take drugs. Moses' landlords blamed him, saying that he'd allowed it, and so he lost his home. So he'd gone for 3 days to be with his wife in hospital. And in the meantime, his house is taken over, he's blamed for it, and he's kicked out of his house. Moses spent 6 months living on the streets. His partner was still in hospital during these 6 months, and then she tragically passed away. He struggled to cope and at this stage turned to drugs. He said using drugs was the only escape. He was on the street, he'd lost his wife or his partner, this is where he was left. So he became a druggie on the streets as a result of him going for 3 days to be with his partner in hospital. That's how it started. Moses slept through the rough in doorways, squats, empty shops and cars for shelter. Fortunately, a street outreach team found Moses and he was brought to a hostel in North London, which is where he lives. He says, I was in my room one day thinking my missus has passed away. I was feeling down. I felt like the world had it in for me. I had a breakdown and I told the project worker I miss my missus and I have trouble reading and writing. I'm over 50 years old and I'd never told anyone that he can't read or write. So we talked about it. He said he could put me on to someone who could help me. I was reluctant, but he took me to meet the literacy tutor and we just clicked. And from there, everything started to fall into place. So he started to just learn how to read and write. And this started turning his life around. Improving his literary skills has had a big impact on Moses' daily life. He now reads the newspaper and can stay in touch with his family. He writes to his parents who live in Jamaica, and he's better able to stay in touch with his 3 children and 5 grandchildren because they don't live together, but now he can write. So he says they're pleased with me learning to keep in contact with them. I used to have this problem with writing. Now I can even send them texts. So his family life has improved. He's got a bit of hope now. So says Moses, if everything goes well, Moses would like to enroll in a college course, but he feels he still needs more practice to get his reading and writing stronger first. Health problems have affected his mobility, and some days he struggles to leave his room, but Moses is looking forward to trying college in the future. He hopes to be rehoused somewhere that his children and grandchildren can come to visit him. That's why I have to get my life sorted. He's got children and grandchildren. He feels I've got to get things together. He's got hope. He's got a goal, and so he's working hard to pick his life up. Now, that's just a story. It's a random one, but a true one, that gives so much more color to this like homeless guy on the street. That he's sleeping there. We don't know why he's there, but now we do know. We do know how it happened. And in this case, how did it happen? It happened through being away for 3 days from his house and his house being taken over. When you hear the story, you feel a bit more for this human being because you know the details. You know that actually this is a guy who had somewhat of a normal life, and it spiraled downwards quite suddenly, and he lost it all. So to go from being like, he sounds like a nice guy who just had a really rough ride to being on the streets a druggie, and who knows what he did to live that lifestyle, to maintain that lifestyle. But it happened through certain circumstances. Now we can always also be harsh and judgmental and say, well, how could he let such things happen? And what type of friends does he have? And there are harsher ways of looking at the story, but certainly as a feeling human being, you feel a sense of compassion for a essentially good guy who had a rough ride. So if we would look at our soul in a similar way, and our soul is also this beautiful, pristine being that has been plunged down into this world. That it's in a tough neighborhood, our soul. It's a difficult place to be stuck in a body. To feel a sense of compassion and see the purity of the soul that has been plunged into this state of lowliness through no fault of its own. You feel bad, you feel sorry. But what makes this worse is that the descent that our soul has experienced into this world is one that is not just about the soul coming into the world, but it's what we do with our soul after it's come down into this world. In this story of Moses, what was the turning point in this story that took him from living a relatively normal life to being a drug addict on the streets? What was the turning point? If we could point to one part of the story, where did things go bad? Losing his home, right. And how did that happen? How did he lose his home? He didn't guard it? When he went to be with his partner in hospital?
Too much chesed.
Too much chesed? Well, how?
He didn't have the discipline to look after his home at the same time, to leave his wife at night, to look after his things. He just stayed and kind of lost track.
Yeah?
Did he give his friends the key so they could stay there? And he was trying to do it to be nice, but it ended up backfiring because they were drug addicts, and maybe he should have used his brains to not let them in.
Right. So this is the part of the story that we don't know, but we can fill it in and guess, but we can only guess. Definitely what went wrong was his friends going into his apartment when he was away. What he did was a valiant thing to be and stay in the hospital with his partner while she's going through this terrible illness. That was a noble thing to do in and of itself. How did his friends end up getting into his apartment during that time? It doesn't sound, at least from the way the story is presented, doesn't sound like he invited them in or was even aware of what was happening. It sounds like he came back after 3 days and his house had been taken over by friends who were taking advantage. But was it that he did give them the key, or didn't lock up his place, or hung around with a bad crowd in the first place? This part we don't know. It could be a chesed and no gevura. It could be that type of thing, being friendly and thinking you're helping when you're not really helping. That part we don't know. But certainly, his friends stuffed him up in this one. Like, they went and utilized his place and got him kicked out, and from face value, he's innocent in that. He wasn't involved, he wasn't there. It was when he was gone that this all happened. And so you can't help feeling bad for the guy, feeling a sense of compassion for him, feeling what he has gone through. And if you were one of those friends who just destroyed this guy's life, so then surely, if you've got any moral fiber within you, you'd have to take some responsibility and say that we took advantage of you, and as a result, you ended up on the streets. That is the worst. It's one thing when you see somebody suffering and you feel bad for them, but when you've caused that suffering, when you've actually brought it about, so then you have to take responsibility. You have to feel bad about it. It's not just circumstances. It was actually people's bad choices and taking advantage that drew him to where he was. And so it's those friends, so-called friends, that we do have to question what type of friends they really are. And this, going back to our soul, is also the issue. That it's not just our soul has plunged down into this world, but it is what have we done with that soul as it's in this world. Rabbi Shnei Zalman continues, and especially when you recall all of your inappropriate actions and utterances and thoughts since the day you came into being, unworthy as they were, causing the king to be bound up in the impetuous thoughts of the brain. For Jacob is the cord of his inheritance, as in the illustration of one pulling a rope, dragging with him the other end. This is the esoteric doctrine of the exile of the Shekhinah, of the divine presence. To explain that not only is our soul descended down to this world, But while our soul is inhabiting our body, we, with our free choice, have made certain decisions of how we live our life. And if we contemplate on how we've lived our life from the day we entered this world until this day, we do have to take responsibility for schlepping our soul into certain ugly places. That thoughts, words, actions, things that we have chosen to do that were not right, not moral, not pure and good. When we do that, we shouldn't think that, well, that's my lower side, but I've still got my holy side to me. You're dragging your holy side, you're dragging your soul into that as well. And so in those moments when we're not living up to who we're supposed to be, we're dragging the divine spark, this holiness that's within us, and we're schlepping it into the muck, into the dirt. And so we are causing the downfall of this purity of our soul, this good being that is being dragged down into this lowliness. It's actually our own doing. It's one thing to come into the world, but if you come into the world to do good, so the soul's quite satisfied with that. That's an elevation of the soul. But to come into the world to behave selfishly and immorally, to do that, we're dragging the soul into it. The imagery that he uses here, based on a verse that says that Jacob is the cord of his inheritance, of God's inheritance, that when you pull a rope on one end, but the other end also gets pulled. So too, our soul is compared to like a rope. We think of the soul sometimes as being buried deep within us. The soul actually is a cord of connection between us down here and the divine source that we come from, with God. That's what the soul is, like a cord. When you pull the cord down here, it pulls up there as well. Wherever we go, we're dragging God into that place as well. We're dragging God into it. And so if we're in a place of lowliness, we're dragging this cord and pulling God into where we are. The divine light is also experiencing that. When we contemplate that, so then we realize that we are the cause of what's called the exile of the Shekhinah, of the misplacement of divine energy, of holiness. To bring it into a bit more crisp vision, in our world, if you imagine a person who represents innocence, purity, a pristine, untouched state, so the people that most embody that are children. Children, because as we grow older, we become jaded and corrupted, and in our own way, we don't have the same purity of soul as a child does. The reason why people are attracted to the cuteness and the gorgeousness of children is because of their purity. They're closer to heaven, and they've become less sullied by this world. They represent purity and innocence, and so the picture of innocence is a pure little child. The image of taking a pure child and exposing them to the ugliness of this world is one that is so distasteful. It's so horrible that very few of us have any tolerance for that. Somebody who can hurt a child, who can expose them to evil, who can corrupt the innocence of childhood, that is something that it makes us angry to think about. That it's one thing, hurting anybody is wrong, but when the person is innocent and helpless and you're taking advantage of that, there's something even more hurtful and off-putting about it. We're enraged by such a thing. Our soul is that pure child as well. The reason why a child is so pure is because they're more soul than body. They haven't been in their body long enough to be so bodily, so their soul shines through. That's the beauty of a child. We all have that child. That's our soul, which is pure. And schlepping that purity of and innocence of a child and corrupting it by exposing it to immorality, it's so wrong. It's so hurtful that you can't help but feeling a sense of compassion, feeling pity, feeling mercy for the soul. And so, even though we may have not done such extreme evil, we haven't been so bad. We're not terrible criminals. But in comparison to the purity of our soul, we've all done things that are below what the soul deserves. And contemplating on that we have schlepped the soul into that, the purity of our soul into that, must make us feel a sense of compassion for the soul. And compassion for the soul is compassion for God, who we've schlepped into this. That God invested so much in us, trusted us so much, and we didn't live up to it. This is what's called the exile of the Shekhinah, that God's presence itself is in exile, is misplaced through the energy that we use, misappropriated in evil. So this, says Rabbi Shneur Zalman, is utilizing the emotional capacity of compassion towards God. There's loving God, there's being in awe and fear of God, and there's having compassion for God. Love of God is my feeling towards Him, that I feel that I love Him. Fear is also my feeling of awe towards God. Compassion is whether I'm feeling love or I'm in awe or not. That's not what's relevant. What's relevant is, where's God in all this? Where's God in my life? Where have I schlepped Him? It's not about me, it's about Him. About me being sensitive to His, where He is. And that is a third distinct emotion, separate from love and from awe, compassion. In a way, Rabbi Shneur Zalman started this chapter by saying that this is accessible, open to all of us, this level of feeling towards God. Because what's interesting about this one is, when it comes to loving God, you have to contemplate a sense of closeness to Him. You have to feel closeness. To love anyone, you need to feel close to them. To be in awe of someone, you have to feel you're in their presence. Meaning, to have love or awe of God requires a certain level of attainment. You have to have got somewhere in your relationship with Him. To be loving and passionate towards God, or to be in awe of Him, you have to have been on a spiritual level somewhere. To be compassionate for God, on the contrary, the lower your spiritual level, the more compassionate you should be. The more disconnected you are from God, the more compassion you should have for Him. Because look where I am and look where He is. Look where I've schlepped Him. In other words, this, says Rabbi Shneur Zalman, is a perfect contemplation for somebody who feels spiritually disconnected, who feels like they're distant from God. To have love of God, you have to feel close. To be in awe of Him, you have to feel that He is present. But to feel compassionate for Him, all you need to feel is that I haven't lived up to what I'm supposed to live up to. I actually have not reached anywhere. I'm not reaching the goals in spirituality that I should have. When somebody feels low about their own spiritual state, so then this is a way to utilize that lowly feeling, not to beat up on yourself, but to actually start a relationship with God. A relationship of compassion. Feeling bad for where He is. Putting it differently, like we said earlier, love, chesed, is about me being loving. Gvura is about me being strict, harsh, and awestruck. That's about my feeling. But compassion, tiferet, is about the other, the needs of the other. It's not about me. It's about the other. When it comes to our relationship with God, to love God means that I have reached a closeness with Him. To be in awe of Him means that I perceive His closeness as well. But to have compassion for Him, it's not about me, about what level I'm at. On the contrary, the fact that I'm not on any level, that's why I feel compassion for God, who I've schlepped into this lowly state that I'm in. And that starts a relationship, an emotional relationship with God. What's revolutionary about this idea is, until now we've understood that you can serve God without having much of an emotional attachment, emotional relationship with Him. Like we said earlier, you can do the right thing even though you don't feel like it. You're not inspired, you're not connected, you're not spiritually in tune with God, but just do the right thing, do a mitzvah. It's fine. You can do it without any feeling. That's the entry level, that's the start. But then to do it with passion, with feeling, means you have to develop love, or you have to develop emotions for God. But here, compassion is one that you can develop before you've reached any level, before you've got anywhere. When you're still in your lowliness, when you're still in your spiritual down, where you're not feeling all that connected, that itself is the basis of your contemplation. Look how disconnected I am. I'm schlepping God into my disconnectedness. That's already a connection. That is a connection. Now you've got an emotional attachment to God, feeling compassion towards the spark of godliness that is in your soul.
Feeling compassion towards God because we know that God is infinite and
creates everything.
Yeah.
And while we have free choice and we can choose how, when to connect with him, to say that we schlep him into this world, this is the world that he desired, that he created, that he put us in. So I don't...
Yeah. So what did he do by creating us? He invested in us a piece of him, and he gave us autonomy, freedom, free choice. Why did he do that? Because he wants us to have a relationship with him. He wants us to draw him in by choice. That's what he wanted. What did we do? We ignored all that. We forgot about our purpose, and we utilized our freedom and our autonomy to just do whatever we wanted, to feed our every urge, to just do whatever feels good. And in the process of that, we have debased ourselves. We've hurt other people. We've not lived up to where we're supposed to be. So you can't then turn to God and say, well, it's your fault. You gave us free choice and you created us this way, and so bad luck. What do you expect? No, he took that risk. You're right, he took that risk. But what did I do with that?
You brought him into where you are. And where you are is not a holy place all the time.
And your job is to make it holy and to transform it. And I didn't do that job. It's the same in any relationship, but any relationship is a choice. If somebody chooses to marry you, it's your choice. So what do you expect if I'm not nice to you? You chose me. Yeah, I did choose you, but I chose you because I see in you the ability to be good. Yes, you're a human being, and God knows we're human. He knows that. But this is not saying that you should be surprised that you've ever done anything wrong. I'm not saying you should be surprised about it. But it's saying utilize the fact that we're so incomplete, utilize that as a springboard for connecting to God. That God has invested in me and I haven't lived up to it, and so I feel bad for that. I feel a sense of remorse, not about myself. I'm feeling bad for the divine spark in me. That is utilizing our failings to create a connection with God, an emotional connection with God, which is an amazing thought. That we understand how our spiritual achievements can connect us to God. This is saying even our spiritual failures can connect us to God because we should feel compassion for what we've done to him. And again, it's the same in a human relationship. In any human relationship, in the best relationship, there are going to be times when we hurt people we love, where we do things, we say things, or don't say things, or don't do things that cause hurt. That is normal and expected in all human relationships. Those moments where we have not lived up to where we should be. So there's two ways of looking at it. You can look at that moment and say that I have underperformed as a husband or a wife. I've not achieved what I should achieve, and so there's a failing in my repertoire, in my ability, in my skills of being a partner in life. So similar way to like when you've got a golf game that you're trying to improve, you've got your fitness that you're trying to improve, you've got all these, your career that you're trying to advance, and another thing you're trying to be good at, not just golf and not just exercise and not just work, you're also trying to be good at being a husband or being a wife. And so when I've done something wrong, I haven't performed. I haven't done my best. I've underperformed. That's one way of looking at it. But that's a very self-absorbed way of looking at it. That as a husband or as a wife or as a father or as a brother or as a child or a sister or a friend, I'm not doing a great job of it. That's very self-absorbed. A more profound way of looking at it is that I have let down somebody who I love. They are not getting what they deserve from me. It's not about my performance, but it's about the needs of the other. Then they're not getting what they deserve from me. And that bothers me. It's a completely different way of expressing it. Because if I see myself as being a husband trying to be a good husband, so that's nice, but that's just another one of my achievements. Whereas if I see myself as being what my wife needs me to be, it's not my record as a husband, but it's what is she getting? What is she getting from me? Is she getting what she deserves from me? That's a completely different way of thinking about it. And that exact same thing can be as a child to our parents, as a parent to our children, as a friend to our friends. It's not how good am I at my job, how many points am I scoring, what percentage rate have I reached of success, but it is what are they getting from me? Are they getting what I need? And if I've not hit that mark, if I've not reached it, then it's not I'm disappointed in myself, it's that I feel bad for you. I feel bad for you that you're not getting what is needed. When you think that way, what it does is it maintains the relationship side of it rather than the selfish side of it. It's not just about what I'm doing, it's about how I am to you. So, just like we said that a loving, kind person, if they're not thinking about how the kindness is being received, so then they could trample you with their love. They could walk all over you. They'll love you whether you like it or not. They'll help you whether you need that help or not. It's not about you, it's about them. It's love, it's kindness, it's generous, but it's not sensitive. So in a similar way, in our failings, in what we do wrong, if it's just, I failed so much, I can't believe I made a mistake. How's the other one supposed to feel if what bothers you is that you made a mistake? How is a partner, a friend, a colleague supposed to feel if when you hurt them, your disappointment is, I got something wrong? What about me? What about what happened to me? If my disappointment is that I've hurt you, so it's not about my performance, it's about the effect that I've had. That is compassion, that is sensitivity to the other. And here as well, Rabbi Shnei Zalman is saying that instead of looking at our moral failings as me not scoring enough points, but rather saying that the divine investment in me, the divine soul that has been invested in me, has been let down. That God trusted me so much that He gave me a piece of His self, and that's my soul. And that soul I took and I did this and I did that. That will arouse compassion for God. And now I'm in a relationship with God, even through my failings. I'm sensitive to Him. It's not about me, but it's about Him. That is a very powerful thing. This, Rabbi Shnei Zalman says, is based on a verse in Isaiah, I think it is. And let him return to the Lord and have mercy upon him. That this is talking about somebody who has done wrong. Return to the Lord and have mercy upon him. Which could be read as God have mercy upon you. That when you return to God, God will have mercy on you. He'll have compassion for you. You've done wrong, but if you return to God, He'll have mercy on you. But you could translate it the other way around, and this is how Rabbi Shnei Zalman translates it. That return to God and have mercy on God. Have compassion, feel bad for what you've done to Him. Arousing great compassion towards God who dwells within us. As is written, who dwells among them in the midst of their uncleanliness. It says about God that He dwells with us in the midst of our uncleanliness. Whatever we're doing, even when we're doing the most ugly, lowly thing, God is with us at that moment. We've got to feel bad about that. We've got to feel, how could I have schlepped Him into this? He's with me always. Doesn't matter what I'm doing. He's energizing me. He's giving me life. And this is what I do with the life. By feeling mercy, compassion towards Him, we then rise ourselves above that state, that lowly state. And that creates a connection. That maintains the connection. If in my relationships I'm only worried about my performance, that's not a relationship. That's just me. It's just about me. If I'm worried about how good I have done, and when I do something wrong, I'm disappointed in my performance, it's nothing to do with the other. It's nothing to do with you, and that's not a relationship. But if what bothers me is how I've impacted the other, I'm truly in a relationship at that moment. And that is very powerful. And through this contemplation, you can come to an intense love of God. Through contemplating the fact that I have disappointed Him, I have dragged Him into my lowliness. If that starts to bother me, then that will bring an intense love of God. Because it says that there's a verse that says that Jacob redeems Abraham. The attribute of Jacob, of mercy, of compassion, that can redeem Abraham, the compassion, the attribute of love. That we can regain a love for God when we feel compassion for the soul that has been dragged down so low. And so this, as Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, is a very accessible contemplation, because who can not say that they have dragged their soul to places where it shouldn't have been? All you need to do this is to have done something wrong. You don't have to be on a high holy level. On the contrary, if you've done something wrong, you can contemplate that I've disappointed God, and have compassion for Him, and that will arouse love. In conclusion, we are all these good souls trapped in lowly bodies. We are like Moses' friends who stuffed his life up. How can we do that? We have to feel bad that we've schlepped him into that lowly state. The very fact that you are disconnected from God is itself a pathway to connect to Him. The feeling of disconnect is a pathway to connect Him. Why? Feel compassion for the divine spark stuck inside you that you've schlepped into these lowly places. This sincere compassion leads to love, because it increases the intimacy, the closeness. When what I'm bothered by is not my performance, but how I've impacted the person that I love, so then that increases love. And just like we've all experienced when we have done the wrong thing towards somebody who we love, if instead of harping on my lack of performance, I'm sensitive to the hurt that I've caused, that sensitivity brings greater closeness. I've come closer through the distance. The disconnect is actually a source of connection. And so the compassion is what brings back the love. Okay, any questions?
What happens if something very, very bad happens to somebody? That if somebody was shot, they weren't killed, but they were shot.
Mm-hmm.
So are you still saying that their soul has been pulled down? But I mean, how do they reconnect? I mean, how does the family reconnect?
What, to the person who did it you're talking about?
No, the person who's been shot. When that person regains consciousness, how does that person, how does the family have compassion for God being pulled down into that terrible place? You know, because you've really spoken about the other side, but this is if something terrible happens to somebody.
Okay, so that is a bit of a separate discussion. How do we relate to God when bad things happen? That's a different discussion. But even there, in that example of a bad thing, like when humans hurt other humans, so God, it says he's in that impurity, he's stuck in that impurity. But here God is invested in us, and this is what we do with that. In those areas, God is crying as well. He's crying that this is the world, this is the state of the world. So instead of losing our compassion for God, we have to say that God suffers this as well. A more difficult question is where it's not a human inflicted pain, but it's one that's divinely inflicted. That's a more difficult question. How do we have compassion for God? But that's not what it's talking about here.
No.
Here it's talking about our relationship with our soul. Here we're not talking about bad things happening. We're talking about immoral things happening, like the immorality, our own immorality, and that is something that can be a contemplation that arouses that compassion. It's a different thing. Yeah.
The idea of neshama tehara, which I find a lot of comfort in, that no matter what is happening, the pureness is untouched and perfect.
Yes.
So the dragging down would be in conflict with that idea that... Okay,
that's a great question. Then on the one hand we say that the soul remains pure no matter what. It cannot be sullied, it can't be corrupted, it always says how it is. Yet here we seem to be saying that we're dragging the soul into this lowly state. So the same is with God. We're not saying, God forbid, that God is somehow sullied, lowered, compromised by our actions. God remains God. He's not now bad because we've done bad. But what we're saying is that our soul is forced to energize and therefore somewhat participate in the wrong that we do. And that's what the exile of the Shekhinah means back there. When a person does a rotten act, when we do something immoral, so what is giving the energy to do that? It's not the body on its own, it's the soul. The soul is energizing that act. Or like in Tanya it says earlier, that when we do something wrong, God is giving us the power to do that at that moment. How can that happen? How can God be powering us to do something bad? The answer is that He's given us free choice, and therefore we choose how His energy in us is utilized. So the energy, the soul, God is still pure, but it's been forced to participate in something ugly. And so while it's not compromised, but it's dragged into it. And that's what we have to feel bad about. It's like forcing an innocent person to do a guilty act. It's a horrible thing. The person's still innocent, but they had to be a part. They had to be partner of this. They had to be an accessory to it. So just like when we do a good deed, our body is schlepped along. Our body that is generally not into anything holy is schlepped along to do the good deed. Our soul is leading and the body is schlepped. When we do a bad deed, our lower self is leading and our soul is schlepped along and giving the energy for it. But it does, you're right, it retains its purity. But it had to be a part of that, reluctantly.
Is it that it's had to be a part of it, or is that we just create a greater distance between our awareness of the purity of the soul and ourselves, and that just creates additional obstacles to actually being one with divine's action? That's
true. That each time we do that, we become more callous towards our soul and less connected to it, and that makes it easier to do the next wrongdoing. But the compassion we have to feel is that don't think that the soul just walked away from that. Like our soul doesn't at any point disassociate from what we're doing. It's involved, but reluctantly. So you still have a soul, and your soul is still pure, and yet your soul is energizing this action. That's the contemplation.
Like I discussed before, like too much chesed in a person can be like an overwhelming thing, because you can give too much love for someone and or do a lot of things for someone and they don't necessarily need that thing.
Correct.
How can, I would say that when you have too much chesed for God, that's a very good thing. So how how could that be like a bad thing, if that makes sense?
Okay, that's a good question. That if perhaps towards another person, if we have too much chesed, then that has negative. But to have too much chesed for God, like extreme love of God, would that not be good? So earlier in Tanya, Rabbi Zalman said that love without fear, without a sense of awe, actually won't be a good thing. Because we won't always do what's really ultimately good if we only have love and we don't have a sense of awe. Love inspires us to do, but because it's a bit indiscriminate, it won't give us borders and boundaries as well. We won't know the limits of what to do. We won't be disciplined. So someone who, let's say, loves God to the extreme with no awe, so they may want to sing all day to God, which is beautiful, but God didn't ask us to sing to Him all day. He wants us to actually do other stuff as well. There's good that we need to do in the world that is not about singing to Him. So you're madly in love with God, but without a sense of awe, you're not respecting what He wants from you. Same with a human relationship, with somebody who has love for somebody without respecting them, won't listen to them. So somebody who loves God without a sense of awe actually doesn't listen to God, is searching for Him after, chasing Him, but not listening to what He's actually saying to you. So you do need to have that awe where you stand back as a servant of God and say, what do you want from me? Not always being the child loving the God as a parent, but also as a servant, serving God as a master. There needs to be the balance as well. So love in the extreme, even towards God, is not good news.
Isn't a good example the whole story of the binding of Isaac, that basically extreme love, he couldn't actually exact enough Gvura and boundaries to realize that he actually damaged his son, and Isaac becomes a damaged child for the rest of his life, which maybe has to be played out, but really a kid who gets bound and about to be slaughtered by a father's probably psychologically never fully going to recover from it, and therefore is filled with fear and becomes the epitome of Gvura.
I've heard that sort of psychological reading of it, but I can't say I agree with it. First of all, he wasn't a little kid; he was 37 years old. Isaac at this stage. Yeah, the image of him being this little kid schlepped, it's actually not quite. So he was quite mature. It says in the text, "V'yelchu shneim yachdav," they went together. That Isaac and Abraham were together on this. Before Isaac knew what was happening, Abraham and Isaac were going equally, even though he didn't know what was going on. Abraham was as calm as Isaac was. After Isaac heard what was going on, he was as willing to go as Abraham was. They were on the same page. And so, on the contrary, I think in this case, Abraham, who's the extreme chesed, the greatest test for him was, okay, so are you willing to slaughter your son, which is the exact opposite of chesed. He is being kind to absolute strangers, and now God says to him, now I want you to slaughter your son, which is to be cruel to your own child. Of course, the intent was never for it to happen, and on some level, Abraham sensed that it wasn't supposed to happen, and yet he wasn't listening to himself, he was listening to what God asked him, to do an act of absolute gevura. In fact, it says in the text as well, straight after he did this, God says, now I know that you fear me. I always knew that Abraham loved me, but now I know that you fear me as well, that you're willing to do an act of absolute gvura, the total opposite of who you are. So in that way, Abraham was transcending his chesed to show that even though I'm extreme chesed, but the bottom line is when God asks me, I can go to the opposite. Also, mystically, the binding of Isaac is chesed, which is Abraham, constraining Isaac, which is gevura. That gevura is a very powerful force, but it has to always be subjugated to chesed. We in our own lives we have to have both, but chesed always has to dominate. So before Abraham could leave this world, chesed had to bind up gevura, and then he could leave, and gevura can be balanced enough. So there is a lot in that story. There's a lot of chesed gevura imagery there. Okay, we'll stop there. God will continue next week.